He walked into a billionaire's glass tower with nothing but a crumpled piece of paper, a 7-year-old boy asking for a job, not for toys, not for candy, but to save his dying father. What happened next shattered one man's perfect world and built something even greater. Stay with us to hear a true story of courage, love, and the kind of miracle that doesn't come with flashing lights, but with quiet hands that choose to stay. Victor Langston's mornings operated with the precision of a Swiss watch. By 7 a.m., he had already completed his daily run on the treadmill inside his penthouse suite, showered, and selected one of his meticulously tailored suits from the color-coded racks in his walk-in closet. His driver, a quiet man named Jules, pulled the black electric luxury sedan into the underground garage of the Langston Tower at precisely 7:45. By 8 o'clock, Victor was seated behind the sleek obsidian desk in his corner office, the top floor of the 60-story building that bore his name. Sunlight flooded the room through panoramic windows overlooking the city's skyline, but Victor didn't glance out. His focus was buried in quarterly financial reports, merger timelines, and forecasts that projected his growing dominance in real estate development. The room was silent, except for the quiet hum of air conditioning and the soft clack of his keyboard as he scrolled through presentation slides prepared for an upcoming board meeting. His assistant, Megan, knew better than to interrupt his morning routine unless the building was on fire. And even then, she might wait until he finished a paragraph. That morning, however, she hesitated at the door, holding a small slip of paper in trembling hands. Victor noticed her through the reflection in the glass wall, her posture uncharacteristically rigid. He didn't look up immediately, waiting for her to speak. When she finally did, her voice cracked slightly. She said there was a visitor in the lobby, a child, alone, holding something that looked like a resume. Victor paused, his fingers hovering above the keyboard. "A child," she repeated, saying he insisted on seeing Mr. Langston because he needed a job. There was something about the way she said it, caught between disbelief and concern, that made Victor glance at the monitor and close the document. A minute later, the door to his office opened, and in walked a boy no older than 7. His hair was dark and cut unevenly, as if trimmed at home with kitchen scissors. He wore a green windbreaker zipped to the neck, jeans that barely reached his ankles, and sneakers worn at the soles. In his hands, he carried a crumpled sheet of paper. Without waiting for an invitation, he walked straight up to the imposing desk, stood still, and placed the paper squarely in front of Victor. Then he looked up, his expression unreadable, and said he needed a job. Victor stared at him, stunned into silence. He picked up the paper. It was handwritten in large block letters. The words were uneven but legible. It said he could count. He didn't cry in front of people. He was quiet. He could help, and he could learn. The corners of the page were decorated with little stars, and at the bottom, a large, shaky heart with the word "please" next to it. For a moment, Victor didn't know what to feel. He looked at the boy again and noticed the tightness in his posture, the clenched hands, the way he stood perfectly still as if any movement might be a mistake. He asked his name. The boy said Noah Carter. The air in the office shifted. Victor, a man who had made billion-dollar decisions without blinking, felt the edge of something sharp in his throat. There was no drama in the boy's voice, only determination. He said his father was sick, that they had no money, that if he could work, maybe his father could stay alive. It wasn't the words themselves that unmoored Victor. It was the calm with which they were spoken. This child had long since crossed the threshold of panic and settled into a quiet resolve. The kind of resolve that comes when a child is forced to become more than a child. Victor stood slowly, still holding the paper. He asked if Noah's father knew he was here. The boy said no. He had taken the subway by himself, found the address from a newspaper, chose this building because it was the biggest, because people said Victor Langston could fix anything. Victor didn't remember moving from behind the desk. He knelt beside the boy at eye level now. In that moment, the office, the glass, the cityscape, the spreadsheets, all fell away. What remained was a boy in worn shoes who had walked into a tower of power not to beg, not to cry, but to try. That night, Victor would lie awake, playing that moment over and over. But now, he simply placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and told him they were going to see his father. They left the office together, to the confusion of his assistant and the wide eyes of every employee who saw Victor Langston, flawless and untouchable, walking through the lobby hand in hand with a small boy. The car ride was quiet. Noah sat in the back seat, his hands still clinging to his resume. He gave short, precise directions. Victor noticed the neighborhoods growing grayer, the buildings shorter, the streets rougher. Eventually, they arrived at a rundown apartment complex with peeling paint and broken mailboxes. They climbed 2 flights of stairs to a unit that smelled faintly of damp carpet and dust. Noah pulled out a key from a shoelace necklace and opened the door. Inside, the space was dim. A small kitchenette, a fold-out couch, a single mattress on the floor, and stacks of unopened envelopes on a table. On the mattress lay a man, pale, unmoving, breathing shallowly. This, Noah whispered, was his dad, Andrew Carter. Victor stepped inside, the weight of the room pressing against him. He'd walked through penthouses and presidential suites without blinking, but this one-bedroom apartment made his chest tighten. He asked when Andrew had last seen a doctor. Noah said months ago they couldn't afford another visit. Victor stepped closer. Andrew looked like he hadn't eaten properly in weeks. His skin was grayish. His hands trembled even in sleep. The boy had cleaned the apartment as best as he could. Dishes were stacked neatly. A small blanket was folded on the couch. A drawing, childlike, colorful, was taped to the fridge. Victor stood silently, taking it all in. He knew poverty. He had grown up in a small town, in a small house with leaky windows, but he had never seen a child bear this much. Noah stood by the wall, waiting, not begging, just waiting. That's what stayed with Victor, that he wasn't looking for a savior. He was looking for a chance, for someone to see him and not walk away. Victor nodded once. They were going to fix this. He didn't know how, not yet, but the moment the boy walked into his office, something had shifted in him. Something deep, something permanent. He wasn't the same man who had sat down at that desk at 8 a.m. By the time they left the apartment that evening, Victor had made several phone calls, one to his private doctor, another to his legal team, a third to his driver, instructing him to clear his schedule. The rest of the world could wait. For the first time in his life, Victor Langston had found something more urgent than money. He had found a boy with a broken world and a paper resume who had walked through every barrier just to try. The day ended not with a deal closed or a tower approved, but with Victor sitting silently beside a boy on a worn couch, watching over a man too sick to wake. And as night fell, he realized he didn't want to be anywhere else. The next morning, Victor Langston awoke before dawn, not from the familiar vibrations of his phone or the quiet alarm on his smartwatch, but from a disquiet in his chest that no amount of routine could settle. He sat at the edge of his bed in a penthouse apartment that overlooked the sleeping city. The skyline stretched like a silent contract he had already signed 1,000 times before. The view, once a symbol of everything he had built, now felt strangely irrelevant. The memory of the previous day clung to him, not the meetings he had missed or the calls he had ignored, but the sight of a small boy with a resume written in crayon and a father who barely stirred in his sleep. For the first time in years, Victor abandoned his morning schedule. He left the gym untouched, skipped his nutritionist-approved smoothie, and gave no instructions to his driver. Instead, he dressed quietly, choosing not the sharp gray suit that waited for him on the valet hook, but a soft blue sweater and slacks. He stepped into the kitchen and stood still for several minutes, staring at the empty countertops, at the clinical cleanliness that suddenly felt cold. There were no drawings taped to the refrigerator, no mismatched mugs, no echoes of laughter. It was the kind of silence that once comforted him. Now it felt like a void. By 7, he had already called his physician and arranged for a private ambulance to meet him at the Carters' apartment. The logistics came naturally, scheduling, coordinating, authorizing, but none of it felt like business. It felt like responsibility. When he arrived, Noah opened the door before he could knock. He had already brushed his hair and was wearing the same green jacket, zipped all the way up, as if armor. Inside, the apartment remained exactly as it had the day before. His father hadn't moved. A cup of water sat untouched on the side table. The lights were dim, the air still. Victor didn't hesitate. The medics arrived shortly after, gentle and efficient. They moved Andrew Carter with quiet professionalism, checking vitals, securing monitors, and lifting his frail body onto the stretcher. Noah watched everything with wide, focused eyes. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He simply followed, one hand on the strap of his backpack as if clinging to the only piece of structure he had left. At the hospital, a small private facility that Victor's company had helped fund through its philanthropic arm, Andrew was admitted without question. Tests were ordered, fluids administered. A preliminary diagnosis suggested late-stage kidney disease, severely advanced by lack of treatment and nutrition. The attending physician, a woman with a sharp mind and warm tone, explained the options with clarity. Victor listened, asked questions, signed forms. He made sure Noah understood what was being said, translating the language of medicine into something the boy could hold on to. While Andrew was stabilized and moved into a room for observation, Victor made a separate call to one of his property managers. Within the hour, a small furnished guest suite attached to the hospital's pediatric wing was prepared for Noah. It wasn't much, but it had clean sheets, a small bed, and a desk by the window. Victor, personally, walked Noah to the room, watching the boy scan every corner with the quiet assessment of someone who knew how to make a space his own. He didn't say whether he liked it. He simply placed his backpack on the chair and sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded. For a man who once only found meaning in precision and control, Victor found it strange how much he wanted to fix the sag in the boy's shoulders. Over the next few days, Victor's presence at the hospital became routine. He returned every morning, sometimes before the nurses began their rounds. He brought coffee and pastries, though Noah never touched the coffee and only picked at the edges of the pastries. He read Andrew's medical charts, spoke with the staff, and made sure nothing was overlooked. It was not obligation. It was instinct. Noah remained near his father's room at all times. He sat quietly in the corner, watching the monitors, sometimes holding his father's hand. When Victor entered, the boy acknowledged him with a glance, then returned to his vigil. There was no need for conversation. Their connection had already been established in the silence between need and response. On the fourth evening, Victor found himself alone in the hospital garden. It was a small space, a few benches surrounded by tired shrubs, but it was quiet. He sat under a metal arch covered in winter vines, his phone forgotten in his pocket. His mind kept returning to a question he hadn't let himself ask. Why had he said yes? Why had he followed a boy from his office into a crumbling apartment and into a hospital waiting room? The answer was both simple and terrifying, because once he had been left behind, because once there had been no one, because the boy had walked into his glass fortress and cracked it open with nothing more than a plea. In that moment, Victor had seen himself. Not the man he had become, but the boy he had buried, the one who had waited too long for someone to notice. Later that night, Victor stood outside Andrew's room. The machines beeped in rhythm. Noah had fallen asleep in a chair, curled under a borrowed blanket, his knees drawn to his chest. Victor stepped inside quietly, adjusted the boy's blanket, and sat in the empty chair across from the bed. He looked at Andrew's face, pale, worn, unfamiliar, and whispered the truth to no one but himself. This was not charity. This was not redemption. This was a beginning. A line had been drawn. A choice had been made. He would stay. The days that followed blurred between medical updates and silent moments. Noah slowly began to relax, just slightly, letting himself eat full meals, leaving the hospital wing to sit in the garden, allowing Victor to bring him new books and warm clothes. One morning, Victor found a drawing on the table in the guest suite. It was simple. 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a yellow sun, a tall man in a blue suit, a boy with dark hair, and a man in bed, smiling. Underneath, in careful letters, Noah had written their names. It was not a request. It was a recognition. That day, Victor stood outside the hospital watching as traffic passed without noticing him. His world, once filled with measurable outcomes and clean margins, now revolved around the uncertain rhythm of a child's hope. He no longer checked his inbox with the same urgency. Meetings were postponed, projects delegated, and no one on his board questioned him, because when Victor Langston shifted priorities, the world shifted with him. But this time, the shift came not from ambition or opportunity. It came from the weight of a crayon-written resume and the sound of a boy's footsteps on polished marble. He had not planned for this. He had not prepared for the gravity of care. But now he was deep inside it, and he had no intention of turning away. One evening, as he watched Noah sleep again in the chair beside his father, Victor realized that the man he had been, the one who measured success in square footage and capital gains, was gone. What remained was something raw and real, something built not behind glass, but beside a hospital bed. And for the first time in his adult life, he didn't want to leave. He was no longer a man passing through. He was becoming someone who stayed. The morning light filtered through the hospital room's window with a warmth that softened the sterile white of the walls. Victor Langston had arrived before sunrise, his steps familiar now, his presence no longer foreign to the quiet rhythms of the recovery wing. The nurses greeted him with nods of respect rather than surprise. By now, everyone in that part of the hospital knew who he was, not as the billionaire developer or the man whose signature could reshape skylines, but as the quiet figure who arrived early, stayed late, and sat silently beside a boy and his dying father. Room 214 had become a second home. The monitors hummed in low tones. The beeping of machines marked time not in minutes, but in chances, each pulse, each number a fragile measure of hope. Andrew Carter lay in the hospital bed, still pale, still weak, but no longer teetering at the edge. His vitals had stabilized, his body was receiving the care it had been denied for months, and the early signs of response to treatment gave the doctors cautious optimism. Victor stood at the foot of the bed, reviewing the latest charts, listening closely as Dr. Mendelsohn explained the next steps. The treatment would be aggressive, but not impossible. There was a chance, not a promise, but a chance for recovery. A long road requiring both time and endurance, but no longer out of reach. Victor asked his questions quietly, efficiently, but without detachment. Every detail mattered now. Every percentage point, every medication name, every shift in blood levels was no longer clinical. They were personal. In the corner of the room, Noah sat in a chair too large for him, clutching a small sketch pad. He had begun to draw again, something he hadn't done since arriving at the hospital. Today's page held a crude but colorful image of a tree with wide branches and roots stretching far beneath the ground. On one branch sat 3 tiny figures. One wore a suit. One had dark, spiky hair. One lay across a long limb, sleeping peacefully. There were no names on this drawing. It didn't need them. Victor glanced over and saw the boy's concentration, the way he pressed down hard with each crayon stroke as if trying to anchor himself with color. He didn't interrupt. Instead, he sat in the chair beside the bed and began to organize the next round of tasks. A nutritionist had been scheduled to visit later in the day to assess Andrew's dietary needs once he was able to eat again. A neurologist had been consulted to monitor for potential complications related to prolonged malnutrition. A therapist would evaluate mobility and rehabilitation possibilities. Every detail was under Victor's watch, and he refused to delegate any of it. This wasn't business. This was something else entirely. This was commitment. By midday, the room had grown quiet again. The doctors had finished their rounds. Andrew was asleep. Noah was resting with his head tilted against the wall, his eyes half closed, his hands still gripping a dull red crayon. Victor took this moment to step out into the hallway and breathe. He made his way to the hospital garden, a small rectangular courtyard lined with benches and fading flowers. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he walked slowly along the path, his hands in his coat pockets, his gaze drifting from the sky to the earth and back again. He remembered his own childhood in fragments, nights spent alone in quiet rooms, voices raised in the next one over, the chill of forgotten promises. No one had come for him. No one had ever walked through a door and said, "I'll stay." He had survived by building walls, by learning the language of power and negotiation, by telling himself that control was safety. But here, now, in this garden with nothing to gain and everything to lose, he felt something shift. He didn't want to protect himself from this. He wanted to step deeper into it. A soft voice broke his thoughts. Noah had come outside, his jacket too big, sleeves covering his hands. He held out a folded paper without a word. Victor opened it slowly. Inside was a drawing of 3 people standing in front of a small house with a wide yard. There was a tree in the background and a dog with a red tongue. The sun shone brightly above them. The tallest figure wore a suit. The boy stood in the middle. The man to the right had short hair and tired eyes. Underneath was written, "When we all go home." Victor folded the paper carefully and slid it into the inner pocket of his coat. He didn't speak. He simply placed a hand on Noah's shoulder and left it there for a long moment, anchoring the silent promise between them. Not just today. Not just until the next treatment. Always. That evening, Victor sat beside Andrew's bed while Noah dozed in the armchair, a blanket drawn up to his chin. The machines beeped steadily. Andrew stirred slightly, his fingers twitching against the blanket, his breathing more audible now. Victor leaned forward, watching for any signs of awakening. The nurses had mentioned the likelihood of short periods of lucidity, moments when the sedation would ease and consciousness might flicker in. He remembered something Noah had said earlier in the day, that his dad used to sing when they waited for buses, that he had a deep voice that always made Noah feel safe. The boy had said it casually, but Victor held on to it. Now, in the quiet hum of room 214, he didn't sing, but he spoke. He began telling stories. Simple ones. About growing up in a small town, about sleeping under his mother's desk while she cleaned office floors, about drawing buildings in his school notebooks, about promises he had made and the ones he had broken, about the emptiness of wealth without witness. He wasn't sure if Andrew could hear him. He wasn't sure if any of it mattered. But he spoke anyway. Not for answers, for connection, for presence. When he paused to drink water, he saw Andrew's eyelids flutter. Just once. But it was enough. Victor remained in that chair long after the hallway lights dimmed and the hospital quieted. He watched over the man in the bed, the boy in the chair, and the slow unfolding of something sacred and fragile. This was no longer an act of compassion. This was no longer an unexpected detour in his structured life. This was the path, the work, the purpose. As the monitors blinked their slow rhythm and the oxygen machine hissed gently with each breath, Victor closed his eyes and whispered into the silence not a vow, but a decision. We're not done. We're just getting started. The seventh morning arrived not with alarms or alerts, but with the quiet anticipation of something long hoped for, but never guaranteed. Victor Langston stood in the hallway outside room 214 before the nurses began their rounds. In his hands was a paper bag filled with warm pastries from the same corner bakery he now visited daily, where the woman behind the counter had memorized his order and no longer looked surprised when he walked in wearing jeans instead of a suit. He held 2 small cups of cocoa, one with extra sugar the way Noah liked it, and breathed in the stillness of the hospital before stepping inside. The room felt different. The lighting was the same, the machines continued their soft, constant chorus, but there was something alive in the air, something beginning. Sarah Lang, one of the attending nurses, had written in her early report that Andrew Carter had begun to stir more frequently overnight, responding to light, shifting his head toward familiar voices. It was a small note, easily lost in a larger file, but to Victor it was everything. Inside the room, Noah was already awake. He sat cross-legged in the chair beside his father, a picture book on his lap, though his eyes weren't reading. They were watching, waiting. Victor handed him the cocoa and placed the bag of pastries on the side table without a word. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. They simply sat beside each other, side by side in the soft light of a new day, like they had done it 100 times before. By mid-morning, the doctors made their rounds. Dr. Mendelsohn delivered the news with a cautious optimism that had become her hallmark. Andrew's vitals remained steady. His oxygen levels were holding. More importantly, the neurologist confirmed promising signs of brain activity. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a guarantee. But it was momentum, and in places like this, momentum meant everything. Victor arranged to remain at the hospital that day. His team had shifted meetings, rerouted calls, and updated schedules to accommodate his absence. But Victor didn't view this as an absence. He was exactly where he needed to be. And for the first time in his professional life, he didn't care what meetings he missed. Just after noon, Victor and Noah returned to room 214 after a walk through the hospital garden. The nurses had placed fresh flowers on the windowsill and rearranged the machines to make the space feel more like a bedroom than an intensive care unit. Noah walked straight to his father's side and took his hand. Then something happened. Andrew's fingers twitched. Victor froze mid-step. Noah looked up. Then Andrew's eyelids fluttered, slow at first, then more focused. His head turned slightly, his brow furrowed with effort. His breathing quickened. He blinked again. Then his eyes opened. His gaze wandered, unfocused, but then locked on the boy beside him. "Dad," Noah whispered, barely audible. Andrew's mouth moved. A dry rasp of air escaped his lips. His vocal cords struggled against disuse. Then, faint and cracked but unmistakable, he whispered back, "Noah." The word shattered the air like sunlight through a storm. The nurse called for the doctor. Footsteps filled the hall. Machines beeped faster. The medical team moved swiftly around the bed, checking vitals, flashing lights into Andrew's eyes, asking questions he barely had the strength to answer. But Victor didn't hear any of it. He stood near the foot of the bed, heart pounding, eyes locked on the father and son reaching across days of silence to touch again. After the rush settled and the monitors steadied, Andrew looked toward Victor for the first time. His eyes were clouded with exhaustion, but there was recognition. Not from memory, but from presence. From hours of silence. From watching. From the weight of another man keeping vigil at his bedside. Andrew tried to speak again. His throat caught. Victor stepped closer and gently touched the edge of the blanket. "Don't rush," he said, voice low. "We're not going anywhere." Noah climbed onto the bed and rested his head near his father's shoulder, careful not to disturb the wires. Andrew's hand found its way to the boy's hair, brushing it gently. The gesture, so small, so familiar, struck Victor harder than any boardroom defeat or financial risk ever had. It was the return of something once thought lost. Not health, not safety, but connection. That evening, as the hospital quieted again, Victor and Noah sat outside in the garden courtyard. The air was cool, the sky bruised with shades of pink and gold. Noah leaned against Victor, wrapped in the jacket he had received from the nurses earlier that week. His voice was soft, his words heavy with meaning. "She said my name," he whispered. Victor looked at him and nodded slowly. "She was never gone," he said. "She was just finding her way back." Noah tilted his head up. "You helped her," he said. "You helped us." Victor didn't respond right away. He looked up at the fading light, the quiet world, the first stars beginning to flicker above. Then he made a decision he had been leaning toward for days. Not a moment of inspiration. Not a dramatic declaration. Just a quiet, complete commitment. Later that night, a social worker named Julia Bennett returned for a follow-up. She had spoken with Victor on the phone after Andrew's admission, but this was her first time seeing the new reality in motion. They met in a small family room while Noah sat nearby drawing a picture of his father in bed with a crown on his head. Julia reviewed the documentation Victor's legal team had already prepared. Paperwork securing medical rights, establishing temporary guardianship of Noah should Andrew's condition regress, and offering financial support without public trace. She looked at Victor with quiet curiosity. "You've done more than most people would," she said. Victor leaned forward. "It's not charity," he said. "It's family, even if it doesn't look the way people expect." Julia studied him, then asked the question carefully. "If something happens to Andrew, if it becomes permanent, are you prepared to take full guardianship of Noah?" Victor didn't hesitate, not anymore. "Yes," he said. "If it ever comes to that, I want to be there for him." The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of truth. Later that night, Victor returned to room 214. Andrew was sleeping again, his breathing deeper, his color slightly improved. Noah was sitting beside him, flipping through a new picture book. He looked up when Victor entered and held up a fresh drawing. This one was of a house, a large tree, and 3 figures on the porch: a boy, a man in a suit, and a recovering father, all holding hands. Victor sat beside him. "Where's this?" he asked. Noah smiled. "Our home," he said, "when we're all together." Victor swallowed the tightness in his throat. "Then let's make that real," he said. That same evening, Victor made a call to one of his senior property managers. A warm apartment was prepared in one of his buildings near the city's botanical gardens. It had 2 bedrooms, sunlight in the morning, and shelves already stocked with children's books and art supplies. It wasn't permanent, but it was ready. When he told Andrew later, when the man was strong enough to listen, Andrew cried for the first time since waking up, not from fear, but from the realization that they hadn't been forgotten, that someone had come, that someone had stayed. That night, after Noah had been tucked into the fold-out bed beside his father's hospital bed, after Victor turned off the overhead lights and sat in the armchair by the window, the boy opened his eyes one last time. "Do you think everything will stay like this?" he asked. Victor didn't lie. "It won't always be easy," he said, "but I'll be here. We'll get through it together." Noah reached for his hand, and in the dark, Victor held it. "I'm glad I came to your office," Noah whispered. Victor closed his eyes. "So am I," he said. "You changed everything." And as the machines continued their steady rhythm and the hospital faded into stillness, Victor remained at their side, not as a visitor, not as a rescuer, but as someone who had found what he didn't know he was missing. Not success, not status, but a reason to stay. The 8th day unfolded not with the dramatic crescendo of a climax, but with the gentle, unmistakable rhythm of something real taking root. The hospital, once a place of quiet dread and cautious hope, now breathed with a different energy around room 214. Victor Langston arrived early, as he always did now, his footsteps no longer echoing with detachment or duty, but with quiet familiarity and steady presence. He greeted the staff by name, exchanged updates with the nurses, and carried with him a bag of cocoa and a small tin of blueberry muffins, freshly baked, the kind Noah had once drawn on the corner of a napkin during a quiet evening in the lounge. Inside room 214, Andrew Carter sat upright in bed for the first time without assistance. His color had returned slowly over the past days. The IVs still fed into his veins, monitors still tracked every breath, but his eyes were clearer, his voice no longer a ghost of itself. This morning, he smiled at his son. Not a weak, exhausted curl of the mouth, but a full, tired, honest smile. Noah practically glowed. He fed his father spoonfuls of warm oatmeal and recounted everything that had happened while he was unconscious. He spoke of the nurses, the garden, the cocoa, and how Victor had stayed, how he had helped, how he had listened. Victor sat quietly by the window as the boy spoke, his eyes moving between the father and son, listening to every word like it was sacred. He wasn't the center of the story, and that was how it should be. He had come into their lives not to take over, but to hold space. And that space was now filled with a bond far deeper than obligation. At one point during the conversation, Andrew looked toward Victor with a gaze that said everything he couldn't yet articulate. It was gratitude, yes, but more than that, it was understanding. That something unspoken and irrevocable had occurred in the days he'd been asleep. Something that rewrote the rules of what family could look like. After a while, Victor stepped out into the hallway to give them time alone. He found himself staring at a framed painting he had never noticed before, a watercolor tree with thick roots branching out unevenly, winding into soil that held both cracks and stones. For a long moment, he simply stood there, seeing in it something that mirrored this entire experience. Life didn't have to grow perfectly. It only needed space, and light, and time. Later that afternoon, he met with Dr. Mendelson and Julia Bennett, the social worker. Sarah, the nutritionist, had prepared an ongoing meal plan. The rehab team had outlined a recovery regimen. The hospital's financial office had been instructed not to bill the Carter family for anything. Julia reviewed the next steps and offered cautious optimism regarding Andrew's discharge and reintegration into daily life. The only missing piece now was housing, and Victor had already taken care of that. That evening, when Victor returned to the room, he found Noah sitting on the floor near the foot of the bed, bent over a new drawing. It was one of his most detailed yet. A house with wide windows, a yard filled with flowers, a swing under a tree. On the porch, 3 people stood, a man in a suit, a man with short hair and tired eyes, and a boy with dark hair and a smile that stretched across the page. Above them was a banner that read, "My Real Family." Victor sat down beside him. Noah handed him the paper wordlessly. The boy didn't need to explain. Victor understood. This wasn't imagination. It was intention. He told Noah softly that the apartment was ready, that it was close to a park and had plenty of light, that there was a desk for drawing and a shelf already filled with books, that it was theirs for as long as they wanted it. Noah looked up at his father, who was listening from the bed, and then back at Victor. He didn't ask if it was too much. He didn't say thank you in the hollow, polite way children are taught. He simply said, "Can we go together?" And Victor nodded. Later that night, as Victor prepared to leave the hospital, Noah ran after him down the hallway and wrapped his arms tightly around his waist. He was small, but the weight of his hug was immense. "You'll come back tomorrow, right?" he asked. Victor knelt, met his eyes, and whispered, "I'm not going anywhere." The words hung in the air like a vow, not declared loudly but carried with unshakable conviction. And as he stepped out into the cool evening, the city lights glittering across the skyline, Victor Langston realized something that settled deep in his chest. He had built towers, reshaped neighborhoods, forged deals that changed entire regions, but nothing compared to this. A boy had walked into his life with 5 words and a paper heart. "I need a job, please." And in answering that call, Victor hadn't just changed a life. He had finally found his own. He was no longer the man behind the glass. He was someone who stayed, someone who chose love over comfort, people over power, and purpose over pride. And in that choice, he had discovered the one thing he never expected to find: home. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful true stories that remind us what really matters. And tell us in the comments, Where are you watching from? We love seeing how far these stories travel. See you in the next one.